We're joined now by linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, activist, and author of the forthcoming book, Climate Crisis and the Green New Deal, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Perhaps one of the well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. I want to echo what Virgil's sentiments are. Your voice is so incredibly meaningful and persuasive as someone who is deeply respected, obviously, for both your scholarship and kind of your political opinions over the course of time. And so it made big news, understandably, a few months ago when you came out very strongly advocating for leftists who at the time were, many of whom were very frustrated by the way the primary season ended, to pledge their votes to Joe Biden.
What?
To vote for Joe Biden.
Oh, I didn't say that.
Okay, can you clarify then? What is your position?
Is 1,000 times as loud as possible, you should vote against Trump. Now it happens that there's a technical fact which says when you want to vote against Trump, you have to push a lever for Biden. But the left doesn't get involved in these games. The idea of making elections the be-all and end-all of politics is the mainstream conservative idea. The idea is politics is supposed to be restricted to electoral extravaganzas. You show up every couple of years and push a lever, then you go home. The official doctrine, I've repeated it, quoted it from the main sources, is you're supposed to be spectators, not participants. Your job as a citizen is to show up every once in a while, pick one or another of the so-called responsible men, and then go home. To use the phrase of the main writers on the topic, Walter Lippmann in this case, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, the public, have to be put in their place. They have a role to show up and vote now and then, period. Now, the left has always taken a very different view. Real politics consists of constant activism. Every once in a while, an event comes up in which you have to take a couple of minutes to decide whether it's worth pushing a lever to keep out someone who's truly dangerous. So if in this case, the argument for that is simply overwhelming, is the most dangerous figure ever to have appeared in political history. So yes, take a couple of minutes, vote against him, then proceed back to real politics, which is the constant activism, which in fact has pushed Biden's program to the left of any of his predecessors, and if it continues, can go more. But the principle is vote against Trump, then challenge Biden.
Well, I think the argument that's being made by some on the left, including myself earlier in this election cycle, was that by withholding one's vote, by saying I'm not going to vote for Biden, or as you say, against Trump unconditionally, you could continue to push Biden to the left at a time when he is most vulnerable because of his electoral position. So that endorsing him early on in the process, or endorsing him by virtue of saying you're going to vote against Trump, no one's talking about third party votes as counting as against Trump, right? We're talking exclusively about votes for Biden. So I guess the question is,
now,
why?
Let's try to be serious about it. To say there's an argument that says by joining the 50% of the population that doesn't vote, I'll somehow influence the Democratic Party. I think that's a pretty long shot. There's another, yes, a very long shot. They don't pay attention to the 50% who don't vote. There's another proposal, which is say, keep the activism going, compel the program to move to the left, as was done, and then vote against Trump and vote and challenge Biden. keep pushing it to the left. These are two strategies, okay? But
Mm-hmm.
in neither case is it a matter of voting for Biden. It's a question of which strategy you use to push the party to the left. One is, I'll keep quiet. The other is, I'll get engaged and be the way the Sunrise Movement was, the way the Sanders campaign was, and succeed in pushing the program considerably to the left. In fact, the actual program on crucial issues, like, say, climate change, despite the resistance from the DNC, turns out to certainly be better than any predecessor and not too bad and can be pushed farther. So those are two tactical choices about how to move the program to the left. In my view, at least, the advantages of the tactical choice of constant activism are overwhelming. Keeping quiet has no effect.
Well, I think that I agree with that, absolutely. And that no one I know is really advocating to keep quiet. It's a third tactical option that's being offered, which is to say, in the same way that voting blocs like unions have been able to, coordinate masses of voters and deliver them to politicians in return for certain promises, that some portion of progressives, be they leftist, former Sanders supporters, young people, Black Lives Matter protesters, whatever collective group there is, could condition one's vote for Biden against Trump on Joe Biden delivering some goods the same way, yes, the Sunrise Movement did.
Good. Now let's take that position. Suppose you're one of these people. Do you intend to vote against Trump on November 3rd?
Conditioned on whatever
Not
terms.
Conditioned. Suppose that your demands were not met. Would you vote against Trump?
Then no, there's no persuasive value. There's no leverage if the vote is unconditional.
You wouldn't vote against Trump.
In this scenario, yeah.
Right, which means you would help Trump win, because not voting for one candidate, not voting for Biden, is equivalent to putting Trump one vote ahead. So your choice is, okay, if they don't do what I want, I'll essentially vote for Trump. I'll put Trump ahead. I don't think that's a wise decision.
So the argument then is, if people are asking Joe Biden to do things that are electorally beneficial to him, if they're asking him to support policies like the Green New Deal that overwhelming majorities of Americans support, including a bipartisan majorities of Americans, and yet he still declines to adopt said policies. Yes, he moved someone on the Green New Deal. He went from a $1.7 trillion plan to over 10 years to a $2 trillion plan over 4 years, and that is meaningful. Of course, it pales in comparison to the level of investment that many climate scientists say is absolutely necessary for us to meet the UN IPCC goals to actually getting where we need to be in terms of degree Celsius change.
All of this is common ground, but it's missing the point. The question is, what are you intending to do on November 3rd? If you say, and you mean what you're saying, if you don't put Medicare for all on your program, I'm going to give a vote to Trump. If that's what you mean, say it. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fine. Yeah, I think that, yeah.
Right. And then what you're saying is, if I don't get what I want, I'm going to help the worst possible candidate into office. I think that's crazy.
Well, what is the consequence? What are the long-term consequences of everybody on the broad left, Democrats, liberals, everyone, saying that under any circumstances, we will vote for a Democratic candidate as long as they are incrementally better than the Republican candidate? Does that way of thinking contribute to the rightward shift of the Democratic Party over years? And what mechanism will ever stop that shift if we're not willing to ever, under any circumstances, leverage our votes?
So what you're saying, if you think it through, is we should help Trump win, because maybe in the long run, that'll affect the Democratic Party. That's a terrible choice. Helping Trump win, as you're proposing, would mean 4 more years of destruction of the environment, getting possibly to tipping points, which would be irreversible, certainly making any effort to deal with it very difficult. It would mean stacking the judiciary with young, ultra-right lawyers, top to bottom, so that nothing would be possibly done for a generation, and I can go on and on. I don't think that's a wise choice, just on the
Yeah.
hope that maybe sometime in the long term, the Democratic Party will pay attention to the fact that you're part of the 50% of non-voters. I think that's a very poor judgment.
I take that very seriously. I take the multi-generational threat very seriously. As a Black American whose family members have been living as a third tier in American society. My mother was born into an America that didn't recognize her basic human rights. In 1960, she's a relatively young woman. And obviously the kinds of the world that my grandparents and great grandparents had to live through was much more dramatically unequal than even that. And so what concerns me is the way in which the vote blue no matter who mindset basically privileges more recent concerns that are equally grave as more long-standing concerns that are built in the status quo, and says we have to vote for X candidate to prevent X ill from happening. At the same time, those who have suffered under the status quo never seem to get an opportunity to have their issues heard, because a maintenance of the status quo is always a number one priority that will do anything to preserve. And I think that when you look at a lot of who is feeling disaffected right now, it is a lot of younger Black voters who felt like there was an opportunity to pull the lever and do things the right way with Barack Obama, but who don't see any real change having materialized, and that the status quo for them just simply isn't good enough. How do we change that? How do we keep that pattern from recurring so voters have some confidence that pulling the lever isn't just going to maintain the status quo, but do something more?
So what you're proposing is, in order to get my voice heard, what I will do is help put into office a candidate who is dedicated to destroying the prospects for human life on Earth by racing towards environmental catastrophe, who is stacking the entire judiciary with young lawyers who, for a generation, will be able to block any progressive legislation, who will continue to dismantle the arms control regime, which is somewhat protecting us from nuclear war, who will, I can go on and on. I will do that because that'll help me get my voice heard. No,
Well,
I'm sorry.
Professor, I wouldn't argue that I am helping Trump. I would argue that if the Democratic Party, if Joe Biden as a candidate were unwilling to concede these very common sense concessions that would help him in electoral context and would also be the right thing to do, that it is he who would be enabling Trump, and that framing the onus as decidedly on the voter instead of the politician who's in a position of power to actually affect the outcome is wrongly doing a kind of voter shaming that continues to have the effect of suppressing the vote among people who are, I think, very valiantly asking for a better world. And yes, using the vote, the only real tool they have to directly communicate with their elected officials.
Totally wrong. That's
to
the establishment
influence.
view, and you shouldn't buy into it. The vote is not the only tool you have.
Well, one of
It's
the only.
the
I didn't
least
say exclusively.
of the tools that you have. That's the establishment view. You're a spectator, not a participant. Do the vote, go home. The real politics is constantly working to change the conditions under which political figures will be compelled to shift their views. That's real politics. Every once in a while, an event comes up called an election. You have to take 10 minutes to decide, am I going to keep the worst guy off, or is it not worth bothering? Often it's not worth bothering. This time it is very much worth bothering. And we have a choice. Will I take 10 minutes to get rid of a true monster who's going to have devastating effects? Or will I not do it because maybe someday that will help make my voice be heard under far worse circumstances? That's a simple choice. It's not a matter of just the vote. What you do if you're sensible is say, look, this guy is a major monster. We've got to get rid of him. I'll take 5 minutes to do it. Then I'll go back to the kind of real politics which changes consciousness, awareness, environment, sets the conditions under which any political figure will have to react. That's left politics. None of this business about concentrating on the election the way the establishment wants you to do. And certainly, if the choice now is between 4 more years of monstrous activities, which may actually destroy the prospects for human life on Earth, and will certainly make doing anything we want far more difficult, the choice is either that or voting against him and then going back to the activist work that changes conditions and will compel them to move towards more progressive ends. That's the choice. You don't concentrate on the vote. The vote is the least of politics. That's establishment propaganda.
Professor, you mentioned earlier that activism has moved Biden to the left over the course of the general election campaign. That's curious to me because what I've seen is Biden resisting moving to the left. One famous note, out of the DNC Unity Commission, the Sanders-Biden Unity Commission, one of the recommendations was postal banking, letting the post office operate as essentially a credit union. And it was reported that Biden made a phone call to the banks and told them, don't worry about that. That's just something for the Warren people. We're not actually going to do that. So my question to you is, how has Biden been moved to the left?
Well, very clearly. What you're saying is he didn't move as far as you wanted. True, he didn't move as far as I wanted. But take a look at the programs. So you look at the campaign, take, say, climate change, the most important thing. His program is way to the left of any previous one, certainly to the left of what the DNC wants, calling for nowhere near far enough, but much farther to the left. I can quote it for you if you want, or you can look it up. Same on other issues. Not as far as I would like, but it has been moved. Same is true of everyone in the past. Lyndon Johnson didn't go as far as I would have liked on civil rights, but he went farther than anything in the past. Richard Nixon didn't go as far as I wanted on protecting workers' rights, but he went to the left under pressure. That's how politics works. Yes, it won't be as far as we like, therefore we keep working. Not, it didn't go as far as I like, therefore I'll support the worst guy. Remember, those are the choices. You have a choice of supporting Trump or voting against him. You don't have any other choice on November 3rd. Now, if you take a look at Biden's program, it actually moved enough to the left so that the DNC has been trying to cut it back. Good. Now let's push him farther to the left. That's what activists have been doing, and that's what they should continue doing. But we have a simple choice on November 3rd. Shall I take 5 minutes to vote against a major monster who will put us in hideous conditions, or shall I not take those 5 minutes and help him win? That's the choice. Then you go back to real politics.
Would you make the same argument if the nominee were Michael Bloomberg?
Of course. He's nowhere near as hideous as Trump. I mean, take climate again, which is one of the major problems. A lot of things wrong with Bloomberg, but his position on climate is infinitely better than Trump's. Trump, the parts of the left can't seem to understand. They're joining with the far right in denying the crisis of climate. There's plenty of other things, but let's just keep to that. Trump is alone in the world in pressing the accelerator towards disaster soon. That's a crucial issue. Do we want to support that, or do we want to kick him out? That's only one issue. No matter how bad Bloomberg may be on other things, it doesn't weigh in the balance against this. On the other things in which he's bad, Trump is also worse, but that doesn't matter.
Well, can you understand how, if you are a member of the groups that are attacked by Donald Trump and Michael Bloomberg, if you are, let's say, a Black person who has been the victim of Bloomberg's stop and frisk policies and been bear direct witness to his lack of respect for basic civil rights, Fourth Amendment rights, some of the most foundational rights we have as Americans, that being told that Donald Trump is incrementally worse than him speaks to a bigger systemic issue.
Mentally, vastly worse.
Well, if we're talking about something like stop and frisk, it's a real potato situation with the two of them, given exactly how oppressive Bloomberg's reign in New York City was. So if you take an issue like that, and I would argue that climate is a similar issue, especially given that the way climate change operates, even if you are significantly better than another person on climate, if you aren't structuring your climate program so that it prevents us from reaching the 1.5 and then the 2 degrees Celsius temperature raise at which there are cataclysmic waterfall effects throughout the climate, then your good effort doesn't help us very much. You're trying harder, but doesn't get us to the place we need to be, still results in catastrophic climate change, right? Climate failure, environmental failures, right? So the question is, why are we constantly in a scenario where we're being asked to choose between two options, neither of which really get us where we need to go, when overwhelming majorities of Americans actually support a full-throated Green New Deal program, the likes of which more progressive candidates were supporting in the race?
You're asking, why do we live in a capitalist society that we have not been able to overthrow?
Well, not necessarily. I think my question is a little bit narrower than that.
That is not the question that arises on November 3rd. On the question of housing, discrimination, they're both, Bloomberg and Trump are both bad. Trump happens to be worse. But it doesn't matter, because the issue on November 3rd, even if it was Bloomberg, is not housing. It's, shall organized human society survive? There's a big difference between 1 degree centigrade and 4 degrees centigrade, which Trump is driving for. Yes, he is. We have the documents for it. That means cataclysm, okay? Total cataclysm. All these other issues don't arise. And that's only one point. So the question is, on November 3rd, do I take 10 minutes to stop a monster who's trying to destroy us and then go back to work to try to change the society? Or do I help the monster? That's the choice.
Well, my question was less about what to do on November 3rd. And I think I'd like to back away from the actual voting choice a minute, because I think it's obscuring a more substantive conversation that's really where the meat is here on the left. I think that most leftists, most progressives, most Bernie supporters are going to vote for Joe Biden. The question is how it is constantly the case that we live in a country, regardless of socialism as an ideology, we live in a country where millions of people who do not identify as socialists support Medicare for all. 88% of Democrats do. A slim majority of Republicans do, according to some recent polls. Overwhelming majorities of both parties support the Green New Deal and climate reform. Overwhelming majorities support legalizing marijuana. We are in the middle of the largest, by numbers, the largest period of civil unrest, the largest protest movement in American history, which is making a very clear call for police reform. And in the middle of all of that, in the middle of the overwhelming polls in favor of progressive programs, and in the middle of enormous realpolitik pressure from the base of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden and the Democrats have not just said, no, we're not going to move on police reform. They have, in many instances, pandered to right-wing philosophies and said, as Joe Biden did recently, I'm going to the police need more money. We need to fund them even more. And said, I don't support the Green New Deal. I support my New Deal. And to have continued to punch at the left, and I think on the whole start to undermine the gains that the left has made in the last 4 years or so. So what is our obligation to kind of stay silent as that constant assault on the leftist movement continues from the top of our party? What is our obligation to stay silent and perhaps make our own movement more vulnerable in order to get Joe Biden elected?
We don't make we agree perfectly on the fact the left should agree. We continue with the activism. Of course, we try to change the society, the institutions, the government, all the oppressive institutions. We keep working on trying to change them and to change people's understanding and willingness to act to change them. That's fixed. There's another question. Do we take 10 minutes on November 3rd to make our task infinitely harder? Or do we take those 10 minutes to say, we'll get rid of what will make it infinitely harder, and then we'll keep working? That's all. Unless you accept the establishment position that voting is the be-all and end-all of politics.
I don't think anyone here believes that, but the concern is that despite this enormous amount of pressure that's been put on by activists in the street as a part of these Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, the environmental protests with the climate change movement, et cetera, that Joe Biden still hasn't moved. And I don't want to center it exclusively on him. Obviously, he is the figurehead right now. He has said, I am the Democratic Party recently, right?
So therefore, you don't vote for him and go home.
No, I'm not talking about voting. This voting aside, what confidence should we have that Joe Biden can be pushed if in the midst of all of this enormous pressure he's under, at the same time he is electorally vulnerable and should be seeking our votes? He is still ignoring the calls from the ground, from the people. So I hear you say we can push him when he's in office and that work has to continue. And I see that. I appreciate that argument. But I'm wondering what indication there is of that strategy being effective, given that we're seeing him show such disrespect to the left and such a blasé lack of concern for whether or not they will vote for him, whether or not they will support him, whether or not, but the fact that they are lying down in the street and risking their lives in protest. If he is so indifferent at this moment, what hope is there that down the road that he will be more receptive to these goals?
Let's distinguish two totally different questions. One is, what can be done to change the way governments act? That's one question. We could talk about that. There are a lot of things that can be done. A lot of things have been done. There's a lot of progress. We could talk about that. But there's a second question. On November 3rd, we have a decision which will take 10 minutes. Do we help make the situation much harder for us to do what we want? Or do we get rid of the impediments to doing what we want and then do the best we can? That's the choice. It's a 10-minute choice. For the left, the traditional left, not the contemporary left, which seems to be caught up in the establishment propaganda, but for the traditional left, your activism continues. The questions you're raising are the right ones. Keep at them all the time. You take off you decide whether it's worth taking off a few minutes to prevent the making our task incomparably harder. And the answer to that is yes. Take off 10 minutes, prevent it from getting incomparably harder, then get back to work.
You recently said that we should recognize that if global warming is an automatic consequence of capitalism, we might as well say goodbye to each other. If one believes, as I believe, that Biden is and running to be, he has been his entire career a steward of capital, then how does one engage in activism that extracts meaningful concessions from a Biden administration without confronting capital.
But you didn't understand the comment that I made. If we assume that capitalism is it is unmodifiable to be and the institutions of capitalism of profit making, ignoring everything else, if we assume that that's unchangeable, we can say goodbye to each other. But we don't assume that. We don't have capitalism. We have a variety of state capitalism, which can take many different forms, and we can move it to the kinds of forms which will accommodate the crisis. It happens that there are very practical and effective ways within the general framework of existing institutions to take actions which will prevent the disaster that people who are helping Trump win are bringing about. Those moves do not change the fundamental capitalist institutions. The work contract remains, bosses remain, and so on. But they get us over this crisis. Then we can go to work to change the institutions. The alternative is to say, okay, let's give up. It's hopeless. No, I don't think it's hopeless. I don't want to say goodbye to everybody. And I don't want to go to the voting booth or to take on November 3rd to say, I'm not getting everything I want. Therefore, I'm going to help support the worst. That's the choice. You don't have a different choice. You can either try to block the worst or you can help support it. And the question is whether you should take 10 minutes to make that choice. The answer seems to me transparent. Then you go back to work and you talk about all the problems you've just been discussing, about what are the best strategies to change the conditions under which whoever is in office will have to do this and that. And let's similarly move on to change the fundamental capitalist institutions, go on with that, set up worker-controlled industries, eliminate the work contract, throw out the financial institutions, ton of things we can do. Question is, do we want to make it harder for ourselves, maybe impossible for ourselves, or do we want to leave the opportunity open? Answer, we want to leave the opportunity open. We don't want to decide, let's make it impossible for ourselves.
If these capitalist institutions result in recurring ecological crises and existential ones as they do, then isn't the real fight against those institutions instead of a reform that maybe gets us over the hump in 30 years, if it were possible to lobby those in power through activism, some kind of brokering, those who are beholden to the profit motive, even if it destroys the environment?
Think for a second. Think about time scales. We have maybe a decade or two to deal with the environmental crisis. Is there the remotest chance that within a decade or two we'll overthrow capitalism? It's not even a dream, okay? So the point that you're raising is basically irrelevant. Of course, let's work to try to overthrow capitalism. It's not going to happen like that. There's a lot of work involved. Meanwhile, we have an imminent question. Are we going to preserve the possibility for organized human society to survive? Are we going to preserve the possibility for us to work to overthrow capitalist institutions? Or are we going to say, it's hopeless, let's quit? I prefer the first. You're calling for the second.
I want to really drill down on this and be really clear, because a lot of the people, let's say for the sake of this argument, not needing to disclose anybody's voting choices here, that we're all going to vote for Joe Biden against Donald Trump. But there are many people for whom this argument is not persuasive because it feels to them like they are being shamed. Oh, the environment is going to be ruined if we don't vote for Biden, and you have to care about these things. If you don't care about things, it's deeply irresponsible, et cetera. And I take that argument. But the reality is that for millions of Americans who feel their existential experience is that they are already living on the edge, that they have been lied to and misled by so many politicians for so long, and their own personal material conditions are so bad that they are basically saying, throw me a lifeline, throw me the bare minimum, and I will vote for you, and it will enable you to do everything you want in terms of environmental reform. All you have to do is throw me the tiniest of bones. My life is on the line. All I need you to do is save my life, and I will vote for you. And the Democratic Party and Joe Biden is saying, no, you have to vote for me because of the environment. I reject your individual material personal concerns. I don't see how you can tell someone like that even if there are these bigger concerns that they should abstractly be invested in, that they should put those things before their immediate material circumstances, even if, of course, poor, working class, people of color, et cetera, are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So as a strategic question, why is it that Joe Biden and Democrats more broadly are rejecting these programs? And what does that mean for our ability to actually affect change down the line without doing something that's more radical and perhaps and valuing our votes enough to arguably withhold them at some point under some conditions?
Well, the answer to that is to drop the establishment view which you're adopting and to return to the traditional left. Yes, there's all kind of institutions that are rotten. We want to change them. We're going to work on them. The vote is a small part of that, very small part, sometimes a major part, because the choice that you're making about throw me a lifeline or I'm not going to vote, that's not the choice. The choice on November 3rd is, do we take a few minutes away from the activism that is working on throwing a lifeline? Do we take 10 minutes off to eliminate a major, huge impediment to this? Or do we say, I'm going to help the impediment be established?
But that isn't the choice. The choice that millions of working people are making is not whether to take 10 minutes and vote. It's whether they're going to stand in a long line, risk COVID, take time off of work, where they're going to be, negatively impacted professionally for doing so. And also, these are people who are being asked to do that and make personal sacrifices to vote without getting anything personally in terms of their personal needs in return.
Is that the choice on November 3rd?
This is a choice for millions of Americans. It is.
The choice. Think for a second. Is it the choice for you?
Well, no, but we're not talking about me.
Is it the choice for the poorest person in the United States? No.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that choice is not arising on November 3rd. We live in this world, not some world we'd like to imagine. In this world, the choice on November 3rd is, do we support someone who is a major threat to our existence, or do we throw him out and continue to work on the things that we want to achieve? That is the choice, a 10-minute choice. None of the things that you're raising even arise.
But it's not. Well, let's talk about what this world that existed in 2016, where in a state like Wisconsin, for instance, where Hillary lost by only about 20-odd thousand votes, there were 88,000 Black Americans who voted in 2012 who declined to vote in 2016. This is in a state which has been economically disadvantaged by trade deals for all the reasons that everyone on this call understands. And when polled, as to why they didn't vote, a very small percentage, about 4%, said voter disenfranchisement. Of the bulk of those voters, about 60% said that they didn't think it would make a difference in the world. Now, you and I, because of the reasons you've articulated very well about climate, et cetera, understand that there are meaningful differences.
Climate is the main thing. But
the climate is the main thing, but your foreign policy points are well taken.
Attacking the judiciary in a way in which nothing will ever happen.
all those points are well taken. But to these voters, whether or not it's true, their perception because of their lived experiences is that they're not getting enough change in their in their lived personal
as
life.
an activist, you have a simple task. Try to get people to understand that that is not the question that is arising. The question that is arising, which should take you 10 minutes for an activist, is shall I help get rid of a huge impediment, which may indeed make everything I hope for impossible, or shall I shall I help that impediment remain? That's the choice, nothing else. And you have to get people, as an activist, you should be getting people to understand that.
But
These other
what
questions are important, but they are not arising in those 5 minutes in which you have to make that decision.
what if by enabling Biden to secure office, and what if by helping Biden to win, getting Trump out of office, we are all basically ensuring 4 to 8 years of the kind of incrementalist status quo Democratic leadership that continues to cause more voters to be disaffected, fewer voters to want to vote at all, much less as Democrats. And then 4 to 8 years from now, we're presented with a Tom Cotton presidency or the presidency of someone who's even worse than Trump.
Can't you understand that this question is not arising? The question that is arising, are we going to get rid of a huge impediment to survival, or are we going to help install that impediment? That's the question that's arising. Yes, we will have a candidate we don't like. We'll therefore move to challenge him in the traditional ways the left always done. But that's not the choice that's arising. The choice that's arising is, do I take 10 minutes to eliminate an impediment that will make all my hopes impossible, or do I help establish that impediment? That's the choice that's arising. It should take 10 minutes, if even that, to make the decision. Now, if people don't understand that, it is your task as an activist to help them understand it. The other questions you're talking about simply don't arise in those 10 minutes. We keep working on them, yes, but that's not what's arising in those 10 minutes. It's very simple.
One of the central claims in your book is that it would cost less to take care of climate change than was spent on World War II. I believe your co-author, Mr. Pollan, cites a figure about $18 trillion over 20 years to convert to a fully carbon neutral economy. And that is, I think there's no coincidence that was about the amount that Bernie Sanders proposed for his Green New Deal. Joe Biden has proposed $2 trillion over the next 4 years. The last time the Democrats were in power, 2009 to 2011, the biggest ticket item that they could pass in the middle of the greatest, economic crisis since the Great Depression was a stimulus package that was less than $800 billion. Out of the laundry list of things that Joe Biden has proposed, many of them very, very expensive, why should we believe that he will spend $2 trillion over the next 4 years effectively?
You should believe it. You should not believe it. That's why if you join the left, you'll continue to work to make it go beyond. But the choice that we face on November 3rd on this issue is, shall we vote for or against a candidate who wants to do nothing except race to the abyss? That's the choice. Okay? If we manage to get rid of him, we move to the next task of pressing the Democratic candidate to go beyond the most progressive program that has yet been presented and to move on to the kind that we want. But what you're talking about just doesn't arise. The question that's arising is, do we help Trump get elected and race to the abyss, or do we get rid of him and then go back to work? That's the choice. Other questions arise, but that's not the choice that arises in those 10 minutes. very straightforward. In
As
fact,
straight,
the fact
yeah.
of the matter is that what Pollan suggests is 2 to 3% of GDP, which turns out to be less than the what the Treasury has poured in to save Wall Street in the last binge of dealing with the economic crisis. It's well within reach. With continued activism, it can be done. But the choice that we're faced on November 3rd is whether to make it impossible or to let it be possible. And if you think through what you're suggesting, you're saying, let's make it be impossible by keeping in the power that is never going to listen to anything we say, and it's going to race to the abyss. That's, if you want to do that, say it straight out, but don't go around it somehow.
Well, you and I agree. You and I agree on Trump, but why should we
That's
believe?
the only issue. That's the only issue. Let's get rid of him and then get to work.
Sure, but we are looking at a wider window here, and why should we believe that Biden is susceptible to activism?
Either he is or he isn't. If he isn't, we're lost. If he is, we have a chance. With Trump, it is hopeless. Okay? Not only hopeless, but it's a race to disaster. So the choice is, shall we race to disaster, or shall we try to prevent the race to disaster and do what we can to move them to the left? That's the only choice that's arising. There isn't another choice.
I understand that the way you framed it seems very straightforward, but I would offer that for millions of Americans, including 40% of the country who are non-voters, they don't see it that way, and perhaps they're irrational, and obviously would disagree with them, and perhaps they're wrong. But the reality is that activists, I am not an activist. I don't claim that mantle.
You're
as
very
much as
active.
I have respect for them, but activists are in a tough spot because if you cannot, I would argue that if you cannot offer something that's a lot closer to an individual's life experiences and demonstrate how their lives will fundamentally improve, they don't feel like they have the incentive that you would like to think that the environment is to go to the ballot box. And so it becomes an electoral question. It becomes a persuasive question. It becomes a question of how much we actually want to enable activists to do their job, to seriously consider how much leverage we have as people with platforms to influence what the Democratic Party offers and what activists can then take to the people. And I can't help but think that at this moment where we have the most leverage, because ultimately Joe Biden needs our votes to win, that it is incumbent on him to do the most he can do to make his platform most appealing to the most voters, especially those voters who are the most marginalized and disaffected and who the Democratic Party holds itself out as representing.
Look, what you're saying is I would like him to do different things.
And
right.
That we have power to influence that more now than at any other time.
I would also like him to do different things. And the way to do that is continued activism. Now, as an activist approaching the people you're talking about, you should point out that they should free themselves from the establishment doctrine that what matters in politics is what you do every 4 years. No, it's not. What matters in politics is the constant activism that changes things, that changes consciousness, that led to the change of consciousness that permitted the Black Lives Matter protests after Floyd. A lot of work went into that. That's politics. Now we have a simple question. Do you want your grandchildren to survive? I think the people you're talking to say, yes, I want my grandchildren to survive.
So many people's grandchildren are already not surviving.
Yes,
that's the issue.
You want to ensure that they'll live underwater or have a chance to survive.
So many people aren't thinking about living underwater because they're incarcerated or they're unhomed.
Then as an activist, your goal is to get them to think about it, because that is what is at stake. What is at stake is precisely that. And if you can't do it as an activist, too bad. That's your job. Your job is to say, politics is not pushing a lever every 4 years. It is engaging in the constant activism which will change things, as it's done in the past. Doesn't happen in an instant. Have to keep at it. Now we have a simple decision. Are we going to make it impossible to achieve what we want? Are we going to work to ensure that your grandchildren will not be able to survive? Or do we want to take the opportunities that exist and try to make things better? It's a very simple choice. And as an activist, that's what you bring to people. Sorry, but I have to take off.
Well, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. You've given our listeners a lot to think about, Professor.
Thank you.